Hello my friends, welcome to another video. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Today we are going to paint taking inspiration from the flower color guide. In particular, we are going to paint the plant of sweet pea, which is a beautiful plant with purple flowers that resemble in the shape little butterflies. Ready to paint? Let's start. I noticed that the basic shape of these flowers is round. Therefore, I take my filbert brush in size 10 in order to create the petals of these flowers. I take a mixture of magenta and quinacridone violet and I mix it on my palette to try to recreate this color of the reference picture. I start to create the petals of this flower with the filbert brush by pressing the belly of this brush. And then I use the side of this brush in order to create the other petals. I rinse off some color in order to change the value of the other petals of other flowers, and I keep creating these petals and these flowers with small strokes with the belly and the side of my brush. I keep repeating this motion from the bottom of the paper going up towards the top of the paper, because I'm following the picture that I have as a reference in front of me. I add a little bit of color into the center of these flowers through the wet in wet technique, and in particular I decide to add a little bit of magenta. I keep using the belly of my brush and the side of my brush to keep creating these petals following my reference picture. In order to create an interesting composition, I remember to switch the value of my color, and therefore I remove some of the color into the cup of water and I use different values onto the paper. I also decide to add some strokes in a different color. In particular, this is cobalt blue, and this will blend with the colors that I have already laid onto paper through the wet on wet technique. Basically, I always keep in mind to change the value of my petals, and I achieve this by dipping my brush into the cup of water and removing some of the pigments. I additionally remember to change the colors of the petals of these flowers, and doing this I will create a composition that is very nice for the eyes to look at. I started to create some other flowers using the same technique, the belly and the side of the brush. I mainly use magenta and ultramarine violet to create the petals of these flowers, but I also add a touch of cobalt blue. With a similar mixture of colors, I started to create new flowers and petals in the bottom part of the page. I add a few accent colors in magenta, and I keep repeating the simple brush strokes using the belly and the side of my brush. I keep in mind to drag all the petals towards the same center. These petals don't have all the same size. Some petals are bigger in shape and some petals are smaller. Using a filbert brush that has a round shape helps me to achieve this result very easily. I change the value of my color and I remove a part of the pigment in my cup of water, and I keep creating some lighter values, petals and flowers overall. I like to add an accent of cobalt blue to create a different color towards the purple and magenta, but with a bluish hue. In this case, I'm adding some accent strokes in magenta color that will blend with the painting onto the paper. My suggestion for you when you paint from a reference picture is to take it, as I said, for a reference, but then let your imagination work and decide whether to add more flowers, whether to change maybe some color values, whether to add some more flowers on one side of the paper, and basically let yourself play with the colors and paint whatever you like more and whatever your imagination suggests you to create. At this point, I rinse my filbert brush and I start to use instead my mop brush to create stems and leaves. I love to use a mop brush to create stems and leaves because I have the feeling I can be very, very loose, which is something I like to experience when I create leaves and stems. Looking at the reference picture, I noticed that the stem goes through the flowers, the sweet pea flowers that we have created, and the leaves are in round shape. Therefore, I start with the bottom part of this composition and I start to create the stem that I see at the bottom. And I create leaves that are in round shape using the belly of my brush. Using the tip of this brush, I instead create the stem that goes through these flowers. To create loose style leaves, I just touch with the belly of the brush, of this mop brush, the paper. And I just create a quick motion to create a leaf. I'm using a mixture of permanent sap green and earth green to create these stems and leaves. But I remember to change the color values and the color hue in general in order to create a composition that is nice to look for the eyes of the observer. In this case, for example, I'm adding a little bit of yellow in the form of yellow ochre to create a different green. The yellow ochre will blend with the green that is still wet onto the paper, and therefore through the wet and wet technique we can achieve beautiful results of different color shades and color values. I keep looking at the reference picture to understand where to add leaves and the stem of the other flowers. At this point, I like to create a darker green by mixing a little bit of phthalo blue onto the mixture of green that I have on the palette. I keep using earth green and the mixture on my palette to keep creating stems and leaves. I just use the tip of my brush in order to create a very fine line that resembles the stem. On top of these flowers, I add a few leaves because this is how these flowers appear onto the reference picture. I keep using the belly of the brush to create round shaped leaves and the tip of my brush to create very fine lines. After adding these final leaves at the bottom of the composition, I started to add a darker accent with the blue phthalo mixed with green. I just touched the leaves with the belly of my brush and I created this darker contrast. I do the same using also ochre yellow, and I create a different sort of green towards the yellow, and I proceed creating the stem of this part of the plant. Just keep your hand very, very light and use the tip of the brush to create very fine lines. I recommend you to use a mop brush like I'm doing, or a round brush in order to create these fine lines. At this point, using the tip of my brush, I'm creating these filaments that are particular to the sweet pea plant, and they sort of twist onto themselves. I look at the reference picture to understand where to add these filaments, but I also just follow my imagination and I just add them wherever I feel this composition needs a little bit of green. At this point, we are towards the end, therefore I wanted to add some darker colors, accent strokes, and therefore I use a mixture of green and Prussian blue. I add these accent strokes onto leaves, in particular, that are still wet. Therefore, through the wet on wet technique, there are going to be beautiful blends. But I will also add a few leaves just in darker color. In order to do so, I use the tip of my brush to add these accent colors onto the leaves and the belly of my brush to create darker leaves. The simplest way to create loose style leaves with a mop brush is just to lay the belly of this brush onto the paper and just add a little bit of pressure. You can do the same with the tip of the brush in order to create smaller leaves. I think it's very important to add some strokes in darker color, either to the petals or to the leaves or both, in order to create a composition that really pops to the eyes. I use this technique in all of my flower compositions, and I like to add these darker strokes towards the end of the composition. In this way, I have a complete overview of what I've created, and I can have a better understanding where to add these darker leaves or just strokes. And in fact, we have achieved the end of this painting session together, and I really hope you enjoyed painting with me these sweet pea flowers. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.